Is Ashlyn Christensen, and I am an English teacher at Regis Jesuit High School in Aurora, Colorado. And I am so thankful that you are all choosing to join me here in this virtual way that the Teach-In is going to be operating this year. I am really excited as past Ashlyn to see how this experience works in a virtual capacity. And so present day, at the time of viewing this, Ashlyn will be in this meeting with you guys to kind of help you navigate some of the discussion points and questions that you might be able to engage with during this particular talk today. So I'll just be this kind of floating head for now that appears and kind of walks you through this particular session, which is going to focus on ideas of racial justice in the classroom. Before I get too ahead of myself, welcome, and we'll kind of just get moving from here. Right. So I have been in and around Jesuit education for a while, but it's mostly been as a student. So I actually graduated from Regis Jesuit High School in 2013, and that year, so I guess in 2012, right before my graduation, I attended the Teach-In as a senior in high school in DC, and it was a really very important moment in my young adult life in terms of shaping my understanding of my own agency in the world. And so very thankful to be back here in this particularly challenging moment in time, right? But then after I left Regis Jesuit High School, I went to Seattle University, another Jesuit institution, where I graduated with an English degree in 2016. And with a couple of ins and outs between then and now, I now teach again at Regis Jesuit High School and am studying at Regis University in Denver, Colorado, in their Master's in Education program, where I'm studying specifically ideas of racial justice and anti-racist pedagogy in the language arts classroom. So a little bit of more context about me. There I am, a picture of my face, so two of me at once, but I identify as a white Latinx person, and that is because I think that I greatly benefit from white privilege, although I am very technically half Mexican. Today's conversation isn't necessarily about all of the complex components that go into racial identity and cultural identity, specifically in the world of Latinx culture and communities, but just know I consider myself both white and Latinx. I am fairly new to education, but I am working on shaping my pedagogy to be rooted in these ideas of anti-racism, of radical imagination, and of this sense of some kind of change being able to be co-created in my classrooms between me and my students. And I am, again, studying this in grad school to hopefully help others do the same thing with the students that they work with and in their own lives as well. However, even though I am new to education and I am in grad school and all of these things, I don't necessarily think of myself as either an expert or a purely kind of novice person when it comes to these ideas. Rather, I just kind of wanted to spend this time to use my opportunity here to just talk to you about what I have been thinking about and ways that it might be helpful to you and your own thinking about these ideas of racial justice and equity in our classrooms. An important thing that inspired me to want to give this talk in general and also want to direct my studies while I'm really focusing in on how to be a more effective educator is the fact that when I really sit down and think about it, I can count the number of books that I studied. So not just books that I read, but books that I studied in a classroom setting that are written by BIPOC authors while in school on one hand. And this includes my undergraduate studies where I was an English major. So this isn't to, talk down on the English departments that I've been a part of as a student, but rather to say this is a really clear problem of even those of us who want to study these things aren't necessarily getting access to these books, even at a college level. And remember, I've essentially only been to secondary Jesuit schools and college institutions as well, right? So this is something that I've noticed being prevalent in all of the Jesuit institutions that I've attended, which seems a little off, right? That seems like it kind of is not in alignment with the things that we value as Jesuit educators, as Jesuit students, and as people who um, believe in those ideas um, of radical care for each other and our world. So, some framework for our time together today. The first is that I'm sorry, but today is not a solutions-based workshop. I don't have the answers or a toolkit or a way to necessarily move forward as like a checklist of what we need to get done. That's not what today is about, but rather I want us to enter into this conversation and time together as a place to reflect and discern and use that as a first step, right? Very Jesuit stuff. We shouldn't be too unfamiliar with these ideas. We'll be spending some time looking at the idea of anti-racist pedagogy and through the lens of the language arts classroom initially. And again, that's just my wheelhouse. That's where I find myself most often. However, and I'll address this more directly in a bit, but I don't think that this is only applicable to those of us who are teaching specific texts or teaching literature at all. However, I do think that the stories we tell is the grounding foundation of how we think about the world. And oftentimes in a school setting, the stories we tell and the stories we engage with, at least most actively, can often be found in the English classroom as a nice jumping off point to consider other ways that we might encounter stories as well. Just a heads up that you might find it useful to have something to write with near you to aid in any of your reflection. I'll be asking you periodically to just take a moment to think about something that I pose to you. And if you are a written kind of processing person, it'd be useful for you as well. And again, so what if you're like, but I'm not an English teacher, not useful, I guess. I think that it will be useful for you. My hope is that it will be useful for you still. I believe that we engage with stories outside of the English class all the time, even in other classes, and in our life in general, right? That's a foundational guiding principle for how I view myself and my role as an English teacher, right? I kind of help students and they help me and we help each other figure out the tools to engage with a variety of stories, the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are as people, the stories that we tell ourselves about how other people are in the world outside of the literal stories that we might be reading, right? And so I think that this is important as a kind of maybe extended metaphor that can be applied quite practically if you are a person who is teaching in a humanities class. However, there are some other ways into this as well. If you teach theology, do you give ample time to non-white theologians? Liberation theology, discussing all of the different ways that communities of color and other marginalized groups and communities think about God outside of discussions of these marginal identities and specifically in the realm of suffering or poverty or some kind of necessity then for people to go in and solve those problems with people, right? I would hope that that isn't really, how anyone necessarily displays all of these ideas, but as a student, I often felt like the only times that I interacted with kind of non-white, at least very in an obvious way, voices in a theology class were always kind of from this lens of learning about poverty in some capacity, right? And that I think is useful, but also can be harmful in how we then perceive our role in helping each other, right? Additionally, if you teach math or science, which is a fully different world to me, but do you celebrate the work of non-male scientists and mathematicians? What about BIPOC and non-male scientists and mathematicians, right? I know that that's a very different type of classroom, right? It's a very skills-based classroom where you have to learn certain things. But I'm curious, I don't think I could have named a handful of like of notable female and or non-white um, scientists or people who are big major players in that world when I was a student, right? And I don't think that that's entirely due to the fact that I was not a was always an English student. Maybe that's a more positive way of phrasing this, right? But are those voices being heard from and celebrated in your classrooms? I don't know. If you don't teach at all and you somehow still stumbled into this room, what do you share on social media? What books and films and music do you find yourself engaging with? What kind of bias and prejudice do you have? And where do you think that those things might have come from in terms of the outside ideas that you might be interfacing with and not necessarily thinking about directly or critically all the time? So, with all of that in mind, I do want us to take a moment to, whether we're English teachers or not, or even just humanities-based subject teachers or not, to kind of close your eyes for a moment and think about what you kind of in a word association type of style. When you think of high school English class, what books do you immediately think of? And so, for the next couple of minutes, let's say, I'm going to let you kind of just sit there and think about this, contemplate what books immediately come to mind when you think high school English classroom. This could be books that you remember reading, books that you liked, books that you hated and kind of felt like you just had to barrel through and get through with your head down. Um, or if you are a teacher, um, books that you teach, books that you teach all the time, every year, have taught for years and years, right? Think about what things you associate with the high school English classroom in terms of the text that you might study. And I'll do the same here on my sticky note pad. Okay, so I have come up with my list. Um, let's move forward. And I do invite you, as I ask these questions, to, after we reflect, I believe that there should be an option for there to be like a chat box for us to be interacting with each other when this is streaming. And so, if that is the case, I welcome you to type in your responses into this chat as well. Future me will be there and helping to kind of navigate these conversations. And so I welcome you now to kind of put those books and those ideas that you came up with into the chat in any kind of way so we can interact with each other there. What books do you think of? Some that came to mind for me, at least initially, were Huck Finn, The Great Gatsby, Catcher in the Rye, and To Kill a Mockingbird. These are four books that I cannot separate in my mind from an English classroom. I read each of these books while I was a high school student, and now with the classes that I currently am teaching, I am set to teach one of these books later this year, Catcher in the Rye, which is not the conversation for today, but was a younger Ashlyn Christensen's favorite book after reading it in ninth grade English class, which is the class I'm currently teaching that book in. Some other books that I thought of were Frankenstein, because I'm teaching that right now as well to my sophomores. Wuthering Heights, Jane Eyre, Pride and Prejudice. So that's kind of nice, just in that those three books are written by women, but we'll get there, right? These are some books that I particularly think of when I think of high school English classroom, right? I read Huck Finn and To Kill a Mockingbird, and The Great Gatsby, all in AP American Lit my junior year of high school, and have had the chance to teach The Great Gatsby briefly in the past as well. So, my favorite book of all time is Hamlet, right? So, as we kind of move forward in this conversation, which, spoiler, will kind of ask us to interrogate whose voice we hear and don't hear in the classroom in terms of authorial voice and what texts we deem worthy of studying, and keep and include in our curriculums. And so, even though I hope that we can see lots of change and growth in what we teach our students and what we spend time with together. Hamlet is my favorite book, right? A Shakespeare play is my favorite story out of all of the stories that I have encountered, right? So I am not approaching this conversation in a kind of, at least I hope not, in a why can't we all just study and read the books that I love and I am so evolved, right? My favorite book is Hamlet. Um, my favorite book is Hamlet. Keep that in the back of your mind. And maybe with that, take everything I say with a grain of salt, right? I'm definitely not an expert. I definitely have some attachments to some of these books that we do teach and celebrate in our classrooms. If you want to talk to me about those things as well, always feel free to reach out to me. So now I want us to consider these two columns of who do we hear from, whose voices are centered, and what experiences are centered. And again, looking at this through the lens of a language arts classroom, who's missing? Whose voice do we not study? Whose experiences do we not see in the text that we read? And if you're feeling kind of out of your wheelhouse and comfort zone, if you happen to not be a language arts teacher at all, think about in your own life. Whose voices do you feel you center in your own work and your own reading and your own time spent actively engaging with stories, and whose voices are absent in those moments? Take a little while to reflect on this in yourself, and then again, feel free to share if you feel willing to do that in the chat option as well. If you feel so inclined. I once more will return to my handy sticky note pad. Despite being someone who considers themselves quite the environmentalist, I have not been able to pry sticky notes away from my heart. But just fill out these columns as best as you can for the next, let's say, roughly minute. So, as I tell my students, wrap up your thoughts here. If you feel like something is incomplete, welcome that incompleteness and feel comfortable moving forward here. And so you can always return to this list and kind of reevaluate, or evaluate perhaps ways that things have moved from either end of these lists based on in your own experience and time, as an educator or just as a person who is engaging with these ideas as well. So initially, when I made this list, I came up with something that looked like this. So centered voices and experiences, both in the current curriculum that I'm teaching, although I will say that it has shifted quite a bit since I was a student at the school I now teach at. and my time as a literature student in university as well, at a Jesuit university. And those voices and experiences were largely white or some experience of whiteness, um, largely male or masculine, um, European or American, um, and some women, right? Question mark there. Certain women, um, certainly, right? Absent voices and experiences. This list I had to eventually just stop myself from continuing to fill out because I was one, running out of physical space on the slide, and two, kind of running out of emotional space to realize how many voices exist in our world and how few of them we take active time, at least in a classroom, and how few of them I take active time in my own reading life um, to think about and to spend time with and to hear from. Those included women, on the whole, queer and or LGBTQ voices, depending on how the author or person in question prefers to consider themselves. Latinx voices, something that I personally always feel so strange about as a Latinx person, how few Latinx authors I have spent active time reading or studying in class. Um, Black voices, East Asian voices, South Asian voices, non-white European voices, voices of the Black diaspora, African voices, Indigenous voices, works in translation that weren't originally written in English, disabled experiences, a variety of class representations, right? A lot can fall, I think, into this box of who we do not hear from. And that can feel kind of heavy, right? Especially when the list of who we do center, at least mine that I came up with on this particular day, feels really small and short and brief, right? Um, what do we do with that mismatch and unbalanced scales, right? That feels out of proportion. It feels out of alignment that this is what my list, at least, looks like and makes me feel as a person who has been spending all of their time in an English classroom since I was 14, right? This has always kind of been the track that I felt very called to be on in one way or another. And this is still what my list looks like after spending all of my young adult life. Reading books and studying books, right? And if yours looks different than this, that's great, right? I celebrate that as well, but this is what mine looks like today, and it can change maybe also throughout the year, throughout the day, if you're feeling like I don't know, right? These things can kind of shift, but the overall picture for me looks a little bit like this. So the next question that I want us to consider, and again, I invite you to interact with this as you're able and in any way that you can. Um, what do these lists and these categories we can come up with say about what we value, what we believe, the things that we might think, right? Um, what does it mean if we exclusively study European and American voices in a class, with the exception of maybe one multicultural literature class offered that you can take as an elective, but don't need to take in order to graduate from our schools and institutions, right? What does that mean? Um, what does it say? What doesn't it say? No. And this is where I also invite you to allow yourself to feel uncomfortable, particularly if you are a white teacher, an educator, or just a person with access to white privilege in a variety of different contexts as well. Like if you feel some tension here in your like physical self, um, sit with that, right? What does it mean that when you are asked to kind of think about these things critically, you feel some physical, maybe tensing up or just like an ache in your body physically that you know what your answers to these questions are and you maybe don't like them very much, right? So here's what I came up with. Potential things that these lists could maybe say. The voices of, quote, canonical authors, these are the ones that are worthy of study. They're academically rigorous to study in a classroom context, right? These are the voices of then everybody else all of those voices that aren't included in our curriculums and in what we recommend our students read, all of these things, those aren't worthy enough for academic study. They're not rigorous enough for our classrooms, right? Um, or potentially, you just simply can't learn the same ideas or skills from these other books, right? Or perhaps as well, that can't happen. You can't learn those skills because I, as a teacher, don't have enough knowledge of non-American or European lit contemporary literature where we get a lot of these other voices heard from, right? Because there are more access points for people who are non-white and non-male to be publishing. Or perhaps I just don't have any comfort level or experience teaching LGBTQ voices, let alone in a Jesuit institution, right? Who knows? Maybe that's how you're feeling. The next question I want us to consider is this question again, but in particular, what this might be saying directly to our students and the people who are sitting in our classrooms with us, creating communities with us. And this is a harder list, at least in my opinion, when I came up with my response here. These identities that you might have as a student, um, I don't really care about them, right? That's what this list could potentially say. These identities, the ones that we are studying, these are the ones that will give you power, agency, and celebration, right? Um, and also perhaps um, if you want to form relationship with me as your teacher, um, being able to engage with these texts and enjoy them in some level, or be able to kind of enter into these experiences of people who are fully different from you because they have access to power that you do not have, that's the only way in to form these relationships with me as your teacher, right? Maybe even on a very extreme level, I as your teacher don't see you at all, right? Those aren't things that I ever want anyone in my classroom or my life to feel. That's never my intention and never what I would ever dream of being what I project as a teacher. However, without saying anything and just by giving my students a book list, these things are potentially what I am saying to them in a variety of nonverbal ways, right? No matter how untrue these things are and how far away they are from what I actually believe and think, this might be what these types of things might signal to our students or to our colleagues or to our friends who only see us reading a certain set of books or listening to certain voices when we are engaging with stories outside of the classroom context. Um, and that sucks, right? And so I think that for a lot of us, this kind of triggers this part of our brain that's like, okay, great, I know what to do. I will solve this. I have a solution. Simple. We'll just move all of the things that are in the absent list and we'll just put them all over there on the voices that we center list. We'll just change everything and it'll be fine. That list will be empty because I will make sure it's empty, right? Well, maybe, but changing our books or changing curriculum, adding things in, and amending what we do, it often feels like a really natural first step, right? These things are missing and they shouldn't be. I value these voices and thoughts and experiences. I'm going to put them in my curriculum. Sounds easy, isn't often in my experience, but it often also can lead us into this trap of feeling like it's the only step that's needed. I have a very diverse book list. Done, right? My work here is done. Those nonverbal cues from just what I'm asking my students to engage with or what I'm engaging with in my own reading, it's fixed, right? No, right? Not really. This is a flawed kind of first and or only step for a lot of reasons. One, it's hard to avoid the pitfall of tokenization if you're just adding in books because you know that you need to include a Latinx author and a Black author, and oh, I guess I haven't read anything by a Chinese American author or an immigrant author, right? Whatever it might be, like you can lead into the trap of tokenization, which isn't. I don't know if it's not any better than not including those voices at all, but it certainly isn't the solution, at least in my perspective. Um, what if you do actually have less teaching skills and competency with a book that you haven't had any experience with, or that you don't really haven't had the chance to grapple with on your own as a teacher and as an adult and as a human. Um, what if this just is a band-aid solution and doesn't ever kind of address any of the further issues in our classrooms and in ourselves about how we're engaging with stories and helping our students engage with them as well in the world, in our classrooms, at large, right? Um, and then this also, I think, just the existential dread of, are we including the right books? Are we only including stories that show marginalized voices through a lens of suffering? Are we only including white savior narratives? Should we include white savior narratives? Should we not ever teach To Kill a Mockingbird again? Are we only including stories in which we're kind of doing a level of hero worship and idealization of people? For example, do we only know about MLK as a civil rights leader? Do we not know about maybe some more radical and or marginalized voices? Or do we not hear voices of people who aren't maybe these exceptional figures, but are just people, right? Are we in any ways like whitewashing BIPOC stories in the way that we're approaching them and teaching them to our students, which, at Jesuit institutions, at least in my experience, they tend to be very largely PWI schools, right? Predominantly white institutions. And sometimes all of these things together can cause like a stifling in us and lead us to just do nothing at all, which is the opposite of what all of this work wants us to do, right? But it can lead to this sense of, I guess I'll do nothing. I guess I'll just do what I'm doing and do it to the best of my ability and try to signal in every other way that I care about these things to my students, right? And I think that that is a reasonable reaction to the overwhelm that can come from this. Um, and also why I really think that self-work is a really necessary first step and second step and third step and fourth step and forever step to be taking in your practice as an anti-racist educator. And I don't just mean the self-work of reading White Fragility, perhaps, right? Maybe is that a hot take? I don't know. But instead, I mean, I want you to think about, and I want myself to think about the challenge of dismantling systems of oppression that live within ourselves, in our hearts, in our minds. Especially for those of us who interface with white privilege in our own experiences in life or have any other access point to some level of privilege, right? So it's easy stuff, like simple, right? We'll just do it. It's fine. It's simple. Right? Like, of course, this is as the solution, not a great answer, right? It's not easy stuff. It's quite difficult, never-ending work. And so for me, that's why it leads quite well into what I'm studying and trying to dedicate my vocation to, and that is the practice of anti-racist pedagogy. So, like most things today, this isn't a checklist. I'm really sorry. I love checklists. I wish that this was one. But instead, this is an ongoing and active practice. It's not only asking you to analyze what books you do and don't include, which stories you do and don't include, which posters you have in your classroom, all of these things that do matter and are important, but also of student voice, of learning goals, of ways of knowing that are valued in your classroom, how you assess your students, all of these things, as well as what I find to be one of the most grounding aspects of this, an analysis of the power structure that exists the second that you, as an adult with some authority, step into the classroom. And this is especially true if you're a teacher like I am with access to whiteness or privilege of some other capacity that perhaps students in your classroom don't necessarily have as well, right? And so that is where I leave you today with just a lot of questions, perhaps, right? And not really many solutions. And again, I'm really sorry if that is frustrating. But at the same time, I'm thankful that it's frustrating. I want us to be frustrated by this sense of what can I do? What should I do? Am I not doing enough? And kind of sit in that discomfort and let ourselves realize that perhaps this isn't about finding a solution. Perhaps this is about acknowledging the problem and really diving into it and seeing where it is that that problem emerges in ourselves as well. So I'm sorry if you maybe feel like I've tricked you into this conversation about racial justice in a classroom, but I've really just told you that this work needs to exist within our own lives and in our own kind of spirit. But I think that it does. I think that the things that we tell our students in a variety of ways, from what we teach them, from what we tell them literally to what we don't say, all very loudly speak to our students. These things very loudly spoke to me. I'm in a unique situation in which all of my